All right, let's do this. I've got some thoughts on morning flight that I am keen to share. If you are an avid birder and you do not know what morning flight is, I would recommend doing a quick search about it because it is an absolute spectacle when you hit a big day. Unlike other kinds of birding, like hawk watching, there are more unknowns with morning flight. There are more questions. So rather than just blab some theories, I started to think about how I could frame this. And I settled with the notion of some of these theories will hopefully allow you to predict when and where morning flight is going to happen. Because better prediction leads to more exciting days in the field, improves your appreciation for the phenomenon. It will improve your learning curve because the more birds you see or the better that you see them, the faster you will learn how to identify them in flight. And when you combine all those things together, I also think it's going to build a greater sense of community where there will be more people out making exciting observations and sharing results. But also you may just end up at a hot spot watching morning flight with other birders at the same time to share those experiences. So these ideas come from maybe 7.5-ish years of super keen plus uncountable years prior of at least being somewhat aware of the morning flight phenomenon. I live in the Great Lakes. We have shorelines in every direction. We have inland features. We have world-renowned hotspots like Point Pelee. And so after the culmination of all that, I want to talk about how to predict these flights. And I know there's probably some birders out there that say, I've heard about this morning flight business, and I can tell you it is not for me. But I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say that I think an awareness of morning flight and when and where it's going to go down is going to make looking at birds in the trees and on the ground even more exciting. So stick around, let's do this. So here's my totally made up arbitrary framework. Anytime I've seen a big morning flight of some sort in the Great Lakes, and I ask myself, why are these birds doing this? I can usually fit it pretty snugly into one of these 5 reasons. Reason number 1, type 1, diurnal migration. It is totally expected. There are some species like blue jays that fly north in the spring during the day and they fly south in the fall during the day. And it is totally normal, totally expected, and something you can enjoy. By nature, it just seems to be species that winter in North America or more short distance migrants, and that also tends to be earlier in spring or later in fall when these migrations are happening. But this is a great opportunity to say that these are not super hard, fast rules. I would not recommend looking for diurnal hummingbird migration in the Great Lakes in March. It's just some broad paintbrushes that we will delve into. And the types get more interesting with type 2, onward migration. This is quite similar to diurnal migration, but the species involved are totally different. I'm looking at you, yellow-rumped warbler. They are species that we strongly associate with nocturnal migration, but in certain situations, I have found that they seem pushed or are compelled to join in with those diurnal migrants and fly during the morning hours in the direction that they're supposed to go, north in spring, south in fall. Type 3, reorientation. It's my favorite type. One of the cool elements is that birds can be flying in any direction in any season. And it's sort of a lumpy category. I'll get into the details. There are some very different reasons why birds may be undertaking a reorientation flight, but I've mushed them all together just to keep it simple. Since it is so awesome and there is that variability, in one way or another, just about everybody tries to get in on the action at some point during the year. Type 4, reverse migration. It is an absolute spectacle. It is super rare to happen, but you have spring migrants. It's a spring-only phenomenon that have encountered some sort of horrible, cold, awful snow, ice, whatever weather condition, and they are compelled to turn around and go south. It is a save yourself, abandon ship scenario for them. By nature, it depends on what species have arrived by the given date. The early ones tend to be more sensitive to things like snow depth, whereas it's just straight up cold for the insectivores. This one is for the sensitive boys and girls in the bird world. Number 5, true morning flight. This is the most ambiguous type that I've used. To really boil it down, it's either species that do things that seemingly defy explanation, or also you could say that I think some of these species may just have this biological tendency to undertake morning flight, whether they intend to do it or not. So we will dive into it. By dive into it, I mean I'm going to immediately go back to those 5 terms that I've made up because it frames everything. And I'm going to do a deep dive. Diurnal migration is definitely the one to start with, since it is a concept that makes a lot of sense in the bird world. Birds going in the right direction at the right time of year. These migrations tend to be quite widespread and visible. They're often, but not always, larger species or flashier species. You can pick out the flocks going overhead. Obviously, being near the shorelines of the Great Lakes will increase concentration depending on the weather. But right in your own backyard, on the right day, on a huge surge of migrants, these diurnal migrants can be picked out, flying by. And weather plays a huge part in predicting when each type of flight may happen. Diurnal migrants tend to have a low to moderate tolerance to adverse weather, so it's not very often you see them pushing through heavy rain. I'll quickly go through some of the tools that I use or some of the things that I look for each of these flight types. With diurnal migration, there seems to be a fundamental law a lot of the time that lots of birds migrating. Check your birdcast maps for the big nights. The big days, lots of birds flying tends to lead to a big morning flight. So birdcast focuses on when birds are taking off at night, but you can sort of fill in the blanks between each night's forecast and recognize where those good morning and daytime conditions are going to be as well. If you're really into the spectacle of it all, finding particularly anomalously warm spring weather or anomalously cool fall weather might be the driver for seeing really high numbers or seeing a really incredible flight happen. This is a temperature anomaly map, the kind of thing you can find if you peruse around the internet. I'm definitely always checking my radar at night. Like this is a morning before the birds have landed. You can see all the bird donuts moving south of this rain. This is the warm sector. This is where the warm front is. So anywhere south of that rain is probably going to continue to be good for birds flying in the next couple of hours as the sun comes up. And you can see even on the nocturnal bird migration, but if there is this heavy band of rain, you definitely want to be on the warm side in spring if you're expecting to see a diurnal migration happen in the morning of birds moving up the shoreline. Areas beyond the rain and the cooler air are less likely to see a big movement concentrated as you would in this area. And that works for inland too, right? People in Ohio are probably going to see a lot of birds passing through. I will quickly show one of these surface analysis charts, which a lot of people have said to me seem fairly confusing, but I do find as you get familiar with the various weather tools that exist, you can see why weather people tend to like their surface analysis charts, because there's actually a ton of information on there, such as where the warm sector, where the warm front is. You can sort of infer that along the boundaries of the air masses there may be some rain, and these little barbs, if it is a current analysis, is the wind direction. So there is actually a fair bit of information that can almost be simpler to read as you get into the weather on a surface analysis map. So alas, this is not weather, this is morning flight. And if I wanted to see a real ripper of a diurnal migration, probably the easiest way to go about it is, I think, where are some well-known hawkwatches for that time of year? Spring, fall hawkwatch sites tend to be amazing places to see diurnal migration for songbirds and related species. Usually a bit earlier in the morning before the hawks get flying, but can be throughout the whole day, and sometimes even later in the evening they can pick back up in decent numbers again. So shorelines are great. Hawkwatch spots are an easy way to think about when and where to be, just because the hawks tend to move in similar conditions. But don't shy away from keeping an eye on the sky in your local patch or in your backyard when the conditions line up for one of these types of flight. So yeah, that is sort of the basic framework where I can work through predicting the different types of flights, along with maybe a little justification for when, where, and why. which will be helpful as we move into onward migration, which is a bit more nuanced. The birds are going in the direction you would expect them to go, north in spring or south in fall, but the species partaking in that flight are ones that I more strongly associate with nocturnal migration, like this eastern kingbird, or another one that I see a lot locally is yellow-rumped warbler. And the arbitrary dividing line that I've chosen is that it's entirely reasonable in a spring that's really good for the birds to migrate at night to have all of our yellow-rumped warblers pass through at night, and we don't see them migrating during the day. Whereas American crows, for example, as a diurnal migrant, are pretty much always going to be seen migrating on the right days in spring or fall while the sun is up. And that's where some of that nuance comes in, and you start to say, well, why do these onward migrations happen? If they don't happen all the time, when and where does it go down? The two big triggers that I see for an onward migration to kick off, it can be one or the other or both compounding onto each other, is the birds are behind schedule. So reverting back to yellow-rumped warblers, they like to fly in April and hit their breeding territories, but if the weather's been particularly cold or wet, and suddenly we're in mid-May and they still haven't made it to their breeding territories, they seem to be significantly more likely to join in with the diurnal migration, to fly during the morning hours to get to where they need to go. They seem to recognize the fact that they are behind schedule. And the other sort of reason, which again can compound between the two, or can act independently, is this overnight obstruction to their migration, which is sort of another way of just saying adverse weather. They're flying along and they hit rain, or they're flying along in their air mass and they hit a different air mass. So say it's spring and they're heading north, and they've flown to the limit of where the warm air is and it gets cold, and they come down early in the night. So I think there must be some sort of recognition in their bodies that they were all ready to undertake this incredible feat of strength and migrate for hundreds of kilometers at night. And when they were stopped short, they seem much more likely to just hop up and fly again in the sun, assuming that the weather isn't so bad that it keeps them down. And perhaps because these are not species that prefer to migrate during the day, I do find the flights to be a bit more cryptic. They tend to fly higher, but also because there's that real reason to undertake the flight, they seem to have a bit higher tolerance for adverse weather than some of the diurnal migrants. So something to keep in mind. Birdcast will show you the big nights when the birds are flying, but it won't necessarily show you exactly when and where there may be an obstruction, or it can be the previous 2 weeks that will cause migration to fall behind schedule. It's just kind of something that if you're able to keep an eye on the state of bird migration, you sort of start to get a feel for. You hear other birders talking about how, things seem behind schedule, and when that happens, I find it's more likely to have an onward migration kickoff. Those temperature anomaly maps maybe aren't as important if you really want to see a huge flight, because being behind schedule is more likely to make it happen than having a particularly strong warm front. So it's definitely, you'll almost see them flying in big, surprisingly big numbers on fairly marginal conditions as they get more and more behind schedule, even in their nocturnal migration. Perhaps because they've been brought down by rain, even though they wanted to go farther, or because they've reached the limit of the warm front and they're getting into that cooler air above the boundary of the warm front, it does seem more likely that you're going to encounter these flights in sort of cloudier, windier, or perhaps even cooler conditions, especially in the spring, than other types of flight. I'm going to bring in these surface maps to give a cool example, since it's hard to show every possible weather scenario in a quick presentation, but a couple of cool examples or things to keep in mind if you're considering whether or not an onward flight might happen. And one is that these boundaries, the boundary of this warm front in spring, is mapped on the ground, whereas these weather systems are three-dimensional. They extend up off the ground, and it is entirely expected that this warm air up at the height that the birds fly at night, a kilometer or two off the ground, are going to fly in the warm air above where the mapped boundary is on the ground. So they don't hit the cold air until they're a bit further north, because that warm air is riding up and over the cold air. And that can be pretty interesting depending on the shape of your weather system, where you can tend to get totally different wind directions on the ground. So even though they've flown in on a south wind, you're more likely to get like an east or a northeast or a southeast wind when you are just ahead of the surface boundary of that warm air. My fall example, I think, is one that's kind of interesting where this is not a particularly impressive cold front in fall, but this is a time or from a year where yellow-rumped warbler migration was quite behind schedule. We had a lot of hot air. You can see the hot air still lingering over the eastern Great Lakes, south winds, and everything got a bit behind schedule. And this pretty weak cold front passed through, but it was sort of enough to get the birds from the northwest really moving in huge numbers just because they've been waiting for so long for their night. A huge number all took off at the same time. They flew. But here's the slow moving weak cold front that just sort of stalled fairly close to Lake Michigan all night. And large numbers of yellow-rumped warblers plopped down on the shore here. So whether they flew, hit the bad warm air and landed, or flew all night, landed, but felt like they were behind schedule because it had been warm for so long, it appeared that this very large onward migration of yellow-rumped warblers and other species happened. And this is the surface map, just before the mega flight that happened in Chicago a few years ago, where literally hundreds of thousands of birds were seen flying down the shoreline and through the city. So I would label that as a fall onward migration. You can kind of see how the weather played what I think is a big role in that event. Separate from weather, where do I look for if I'm out to target an onward migration? I'm definitely thinking shoreline because they're cryptic, because they tend to go a bit higher. It's a harder one to really sink your teeth into in your backyard or your local patch. And also, I mentioned how sometimes they fly a bit higher. If you don't have anything that's keeping them down low, I might even head to a point of land along their flight path where maybe they'll spend some time up high hovering, but eventually the birds settle down and you might have a nice concentration of birds in the trees thereafter. So definitely one where I want to try to hit up the bigger concentration effects than compared to the previous example. Where onward flights maybe sometimes have harder viewing conditions or higher birds, I find reorientation flights to be some of the most exciting, where you can get birds flying in every direction at the same day, the same time, going north, going south, going east, going west, and it's not too uncommon for it to be on these beautiful viewing days. I do want to reiterate that this is the biggest mushing together of different triggers that I've done. They're all sort of reorientation flights in my mind, even if the triggers are wildly different or if they happen at different times of year in different places. And I guess also because of that, you end up with this broad array of species that may take part. Just because species are going in every which direction, it does tend to be a bit more cryptic. So a day with a really good reorientation flight might be a great birding day in your backyard, but it might just be because there's lots of birds around as opposed to actually seeing the flight happen. So I'll probably be still looking for some concentration effects, but we'll get into it. Looking at the birdcast map again, this one is very much a law of numbers and averages. The more birds that are migrating on radar at night, the more likely there is to be more birds undertaking a reorientation flight in the morning. More birds equals more birds. This is science. To get those more birds, definitely the anomalies are going to be strong. The biggest possible flights might be on some of the more anomalously good migration weather. And I guess by this interesting nature of birds heading in every which direction and you just wanting lots of birds to arrive in an area, being further away from the fronts, as long as you're in that really sort of positive, large movement, like thinking flyover weather, can still be a really, really, really good situation for a reorientation flight. So I'm going to bust out the maps to go over some of the subtypes of reorientation, some of the different triggers that can kick off a flight of this type. Probably one of my favorites being the spring arrival of a local breeding species. If we pretend that it's mid-March after a big surge of warm air and a few million American robins have been tossed into the Great Lakes, then you have this huge number of birds that might say, I'm quite close to my breeding territory. No matter where it is, I'm willing to make a flight in that direction during the daylight hours to just fine-tune to get to where I need to go. At sort of an obvious level, something that is interesting about these flights is how if a bird lands in Michigan, it overshot a little bit on the warm air and actually wants to head south. Many robins may do this, but they're not necessarily going to be concentrated anywhere, as they all head in slightly different directions or slightly different distances to hit their breeding territories. Whereas a bird in Ontario making that same southward movement may hit Lake Erie, where there may be some concentrating effects that leads to a more impressive flight. And sort of a more interesting, deeper way of looking at that, in my mind, involves something like wind drift. A lot of people suggest birds being pushed by the wind beyond where they want to be or in a direction they don't want to go as a reason for morning flight. And while I think that these flights do have birds going in every direction, you could see how a strong southwest wind may be more likely to push birds further north and east, and therefore more of this type of flight involves birds trying to go south or west. So if you look at the geography of the shorelines, you can see how birds heading west, or a combination of birds heading south and west, may have a larger flight than, say, birds that need to go east or even southeast, which may be one of the more least likely or less likely directions that they're heading. To build on that even a little bit more, it's super extra interesting to consider the fact that birds heading south or west along this shoreline will be flying into a headwind, which may help keep them lower, makes the viewing better for birders. They're also less likely to be flying into adverse weather if this is a warm front that's come in. The rain is usually to the north and on the edge of the cold front, so as long as the cold front's farther away, they're not likely to be stopped by anything. And as they move further into the same air mass, they're more likely to be in a more stable section, so it's not uncommon to have a nice sunny day. So you get this combination of, not only is this one of the routes that may have a large flight of birds, you also have viewing conditions that are really, really good for people. So Indiana Dunes is a famous hotspot for morning flight in the Great Lakes. You can really see how these different things have added up to make for a great birding experience for birders on the ground. That definitely covers the kind of geography I'm looking for to observe a flight like that. Here's the tower at Indiana Dunes, which even on a local scale, you've got a treed shoreline, which can help make the birds comfortable with moving along the shore. And then you've got this nice vantage point with a gap to see the birds clearly as they fly across. And all of those factors can add up to a really spectacular day. And I do think it's really good to help sort of refine these theories by having so much data at a place like Indiana Dunes that I can check. And it's definitely helped me consider this as a local breeding species flight, just because I don't think there would be too many black pole warblers or Harris's sparrows that find themselves in Michigan and say, oh no, I don't want to be in Michigan. I really wish I was in Illinois right now. Like, they're much more likely to just put down and wait for another night of migration. Like, there's not really a significant need for huge numbers of those species to be flying in this direction under these weather conditions. In spring, but also fall, I find you get this local habitat subtype reorientation flight where whether they don't like the plants or they don't like the weather on a local scale, or they don't like, even if it's like too many hawks or something in the area, that they are willing to undertake a morning flight to leave where they are to find somewhere better. For whatever reason, those triggers, seem to have birds pull away from places like shorelines. I find you really need a pinch point. Like the Lake Erie sandbars are a good example, where I find a narrow spot and then watch the birds that are moving out of that environment and heading inland to be the best way to concentrate them. Otherwise, I find I'll just see low numbers of birds sort of scattered far and wide, whether it's over my backyard or anywhere else. It seems like they really fan out. So I definitely want to see those pinch points. And I think another interesting thing, which is part of the reason why I lump it in with reorientation, is how birds really are following those habitat features when they can find them. So this might be the same day in the fall, and the birds at Point Pelee, Rondo, or Long Point are all headed in different directions under the same weather conditions, just because they are trying to get to a better habitat rather than where they found themselves. So this is a visualization of what it is I'm looking for. This is on my bucket list. Found it on Google Maps as a place where there's a huge marsh on one end, a lake on the other, this narrow strip of land, and it feels like a real local reorientation flight type spot to watch. Back to type 4, reverse migration. This is an absolute spectacle when it happens, and I do not think it happens every year. It's pretty rare for one to really get going. And I know some of you are going to say, well, wait a minute, I've been to Point Pelee. I've seen reverse migrations every day on my trip there. What are you talking about? And I can only say that it's just a good example of how I picked these names, and maybe they aren't the best, because I definitely would label most of the flights at Point Pelee in spring as reorientation flights. And while reverse migrations do happen at Point Pelee and they are spectacular, they are quite rare. And it has to do with that emergency life or death, save our souls type situation from the bird's perspective. The key requirements for these flights are the real big ones in order. Happens in the spring, and you need a significant arrival, even more likely to be like an early season, earlier than average arrival of large numbers of birds, followed by a shift to either very snowy or very seasonally cold weather. If it is just cold, you will not see any birds. Subsequently, because this is a life or death situation for these birds, they do have pretty high weather tolerance. If they feel the need to fly to save themselves, it can be pretty crummy out there, and you can still have really big numbers moving. The day of, your birdcast map is probably going to look pretty sad, just because you're looking at some pretty adverse weather. Your anomaly maps are going to be quite cold. And if you're looking at snow, it's not as important, because a heavy snow will get the birds moving, so it might be a ways after your cold front passes through. But later in the spring, when you're dealing with insectivores, you might also be more likely to be fairly close to the passage of the cold front. And sort of for two reasons. One, I think that extra wind, extra cloud, sort of extra punishing weather might really convince them to leave. But also, if the stars truly align, it is entirely possible in short order to get an arrival of birds. So this is actually a map from a day that I was out. This warm front snuck into my local area just enough for there to be a bunch of birds to arrive in mid-May, immediately followed by the cold front, which then convinced some of them that they had made a mistake and made that reverse flight. This is a type of flight where you're probably going to want to have that extra boost of like a shoreline concentration effect. But yeah, I'm thinking of these birds as fall migrants. If I think a reverse migration is going to happen in the spring, I think, where is this famous birding destination for seeing huge numbers of birds in the fall? Because these birds are going to act like fall migrants, and they're going to fly the routes that fall migrants fly. I kind of alluded to this earlier too, but you're probably going to be there in freezing cold weather. It's going to be gray skies. It might be on and off rain. It might be on and off snow. But yeah, this is a spot that I actually watched from one day, and the original picture of the scarlet tanager flying over the water was taken on this day at this spot. So you can see how weird things happen in these reverse flights. It's not really the way you would expect to see a scarlet tanager behaving in the spring, and also it separates itself from the reorientation a bit, where I don't think that scarlet tanager was flying out over the water because it was just so desperate to get to its breeding territory in Ohio. It was very much I feel like I have no choice and I'm abandoning ship. I think a different perspective, or an interesting perspective to have with these movements as well, as I talked about Point Pelee sometimes getting them, is if you find yourself on a point of land on their escape route, you can get huge numbers of birds that just sort of pile up there. I think when they run out of options, that's where they put down. So I do think some of the big drops of migrants, bordering on fallouts in the last 10 to 20 years that people have seen at Point Pelee in May, has been this reverse migration flee response from the birds. It is a morning flight phenomenon. And finally, the true morning flight behavior tends to be more fall than spring, tends to be around mass movements. It seems to be some of the strong flying neotropic migrants, but a lot of that is up in the air. I kind of think that some of these bird species just have it ingrained in their DNA to undertake morning flight, where they hop up in the morning and fly into the wind. So this isn't a big one for how to predict morning flight, but since I'm sharing ideas, I kind of wanted to just throw these out as either food for thought, or to get that extra feedback from people who think I'm right or think I'm wrong or have their own ideas to share about why some of these most mysterious birds like bay-breasted warblers or Cape May warblers or blackpoll warblers do these particularly odd flights at certain times of year or at certain places. So to get super speculative, I know that people, high performance athletes, have a cool down after a strenuous activity. Or we also just work out to get stronger. Is it possible that blackpoll warblers are exercising because they have to make this ridiculous flight out over the ocean to get to South America? Is it possible that they have a biology somewhat similar to people, so they reduce their lactic acid buildup by undertaking a morning flight? I don't really know, but it's certainly an idea that popped into my head. Likewise, I mentioned earlier that maybe the birds recognize that there's sharp-shinned hawks everywhere and they intentionally undertake a reorientation flight. But another way of viewing that might be maybe some of these birds undertake morning flight, they fly into the wind, and that just accidentally takes them the opposite direction that hawks tend to drift on their migration. So if you fly into the wind in the fall on a northwest wind, you pull away from the lakeshore, and you are just less likely to be eaten by a hawk that day. Honestly, some of my favorite explanations sometimes for birds that just don't seem to be doing what I would have expected them to do is FOMO. You just get this movement of birds happening, and maybe some of them on the ground recognize that it's underway. If you put yourself in their little birdie shoes, if everybody's walking or running in one direction, you think, maybe I should too. I don't really know why this is happening, but everyone else seems to know something is up. So that stuff is pretty speculative. So I do think it'd be worth mentioning too that there are other reasons that birds fly by in the morning. It's not always morning flight. It's not all morning flight. Birders may or may not be aware that species like American robin or bobolink or swallows go to roosts at night at certain times of the year. So you'll see birds flying between their roosts on their foraging sites for the day, and it definitely looks like morning flight. Another one that I find a lot is just local movements. I've got a red-bellied woodpecker in my neighborhood that nests in one woodlot and visits a bird feeder, across a big opening in someone's backyard. And whenever I'm out for a walk, I see this red-bellied woodpecker sailing by, and I think, oh, morning flight, it's a bird, it's flying, what is it doing? And then I remember, oh no, that's the same woodpecker. It flies back and forth all day. And another one that I find pretty interesting that I've just sort of called foraging flight is, I position myself on this narrow spit of land or along, a row of trees or along a shoreline, and sometimes I get the impression that, a flock of warblers may fly through, flying from tree to tree, as pockets of birds are known to do on migration, and I watch them all fly by, like they carry on their way, and it's almost hard to tell if that was morning flight or if that's just a pocket of birds and I've stood in one spot for so long the birds have found me instead of me walking around and finding them. So there's lots of little funny nuances like that. Another one being like mourning doves. It's pretty often if a mourning dove flies by in morning flight that it's being followed by a local mourning dove. A male's been sitting there and he sees it fly by and he flies out, chases it, and two go left and one goes right, and two goes left and one goes right, because the local is kind of doing these looping motions following the migrants as they fly by. And honestly, it's one of the things that I kind of super enjoy about this hobby, where the more time you spend outside, the more you notice things, and also eventually you'll just see random things happening. So this wild turkey was not undertaking morning flight as far as I could tell, but it flew by me at a watch and it was a fun experience. So with all that said, I want to do this thought experiment involving a young red-headed woodpecker. We are all super keen on morning flight by September 30th, 2025, and we have all converged at the north end of Point Pelee to see what is going on with the birds when this red-headed woodpecker flies by. It's a sunny day, there is a gentle southeast wind. It's been a big night of migration on radar, and this red-headed woodpecker flies by, going south. Red-headed woodpeckers are known to be diurnal migrants. We see them flying by in the fall, so that makes perfect sense. Unless, of course, it was wearing a little birdie backpack and we could somehow prove that it was actually flying the night before and landed and then took off again and continued south, which would make it an obvious onward migrant. Unless, of course, it found itself in Leamington in the morning and it said, I don't want to be in Leamington, and it undertook a reorientation flight south, and luck was on its side because it hit the large, beautiful trees of Point Pelee National Park. Unless, of course, it is proven in the distant future that that is all baloney because red-headed woodpeckers are biologically predisposed to just undertake morning flight, and it just happened to be flying into the wind and ended up going in that direction. Which is a long-winded way of saying, I don't definitively have these answers. This has not been a scientific endeavor, but I do find by keeping those reasons for birds undertaking morning flight in mind, I have been much more successful in intercepting super enjoyable flights. So I do find that idea of having the flights be enjoyable, being out there and seeing lots of things as opposed to getting out there and seeing nothing, as a super important part to that learning and appreciation and building of community within the local birding scene. So I want to hit you with a few more universal truths around that theme of getting the most out of your day in the field. Starting with the notion that you can get multiple flight lines, birds going in different directions, sometimes for different reasons, if you have the right spot, if you hit a sweet spot. This is one that I like to go to, and it's pretty interesting to see the differences in behavior of birds and the different species compositions going in different directions at different times of year. But I also think there's so much to discover in terms of probably pretty exciting morning flight spots inland, away from traditional concentration points, even in cities where maybe you get a huge woodlot or a huge source area of birds that all funnels to a particular pinch point where you'll get good lucks, depending on the wind direction or the time of year. Even in my local city here in London, we have these river valleys where I find diurnal migrants seem to be more likely to vaguely follow them, even if they're flying up quite high, than they are in other parts. So in terms of like backyard birding or patch birding, I do think this morning flight business has a lot more to be discovered and a lot of different ways to make birding more fun for people. Because birding is already pretty fun, right? So making it more fun, oh my goodness. A couple other quick thoughts. Like even on a microhabitat scale, you're going to notice things as you get out there. I've stood at the end of this road a lot watching birds fly down the shoreline, and it took me 10 years to try to figure out why does it seem like so many birds are coming down the shoreline and then they head inland. And it wasn't until I just happened to see this aerial photo taken of the area when I realized, oh, that tree doesn't look like much when I stand over here. But if I'm a bird flying down the shoreline that's maybe scared of just flying right out in the open where I'm vulnerable to predators, it might seem like a much safer route to hop to that tree, hop to that house, and then head inland. And that's why I'm not getting the views that I thought I would be getting close to the shoreline. And another big thing that I don't think I've touched on at all is how each species of birds has a different preference for habitat or a different preference for how strong the wind is or isn't to be pushed by the wind or to fly into the wind, or how scared they are of making a crossing. Now, this American tree sparrow may not be willing to even make the jump to this safe tree. You may have a flock of tree sparrows that pile up, in the grasses here throughout the day if they are undertaking morning flight, whereas a species like ruby-throated hummingbird that doesn't care about anyone in the world, will zip right by without a second thought of which route is safer. Like they may honestly need some pretty strong headwinds to even consider flying down the shoreline rather than just flying out over the lake. And those differences have a big effect on you as the birder. I've said this a bunch, but I do find a moderate headwind is much more likely to keep birds lower, whereas light winds or a tailwind may encourage them to go higher. So you can think about what your goal is for the day. Is it to see birds really well? Then you might want that headwind. Or if you're hoping to see the most evening grosbeaks or blue jays that anyone has ever seen in one day before, you know, having the birds be higher on a tailwind, the height might not be a big deal. The tailwind might push them faster. They might fly by faster, therefore you see more in one morning. So there's different considerations depending on what it is you're hoping to get out of the day. Another one I consider all the time is light. Clouds or backlighting can make the birds appear more contrasting, so they might be easier to spot, but you're not going to see all the colors on the bird in the way that you would see with nice sunlight at your back. Another huge one that I want to address while I've got you, if you're still here after all this, is this perceived stigma that I've seen around people using cameras. It seems to be a bit of a negative thing with some people where it's like, oh, well, you just took a picture of that bird to identify it. You couldn't actually tell what it was. But I think it's an incredible tool for learning. Cameras are optics. Looking through a camera lens is like looking through binoculars. But if you see something, if you say, oh, I think that bird was bright red, but I'm not sure, you can take a picture and tell, was it actually bright red or wasn't it? There are a lot of field marks with birds in flight that you would never have noticed before that are going to allow you to identify birds. And there are a lot of field marks that people look at all the time that you won't see in flight nearly as well. So it's a huge opportunity to learn. And honestly, sometimes I find it even just helps to take a few pictures first thing in the morning to get a handle on what's flying. Rather than struggling with the early morning light when it's dark, snap a few pictures, get a handle of what the first few birds are, and then I can go to looking at them however I please thereafter. Don't be afraid of cameras. And a lot of birders who've come to me to say, well, I've looked at them and I haven't seen any field marks. I just want to say that I think a lot of birds that undertake morning flight are kind of plain. I've seen it happen a lot with Tennessee warblers or chipping sparrows where they look up, they say, that bird just looked all gray. I couldn't see anything on it. I don't like morning flight. And, the bird was gray. That was all the field marks there was. It can actually help you narrow it down, if you give it more time. Because honestly, you don't have to identify every bird too, right? A bird hops away in the grasses or in a bush and you don't get a look at it, and that's totally fine. And the same is true for morning flight. And thankfully, the super showy species are still going to be showy. And I have mentioned a few times how your ground game is going to be improved with morning flight as well. I've seen a lot of flights where if I'm at a pinch point or I'm along the shoreline where there's this like one or two trees that large numbers of the birds throughout the morning land in, they look around a bit before taking off and flying again. I can see 500 warblers in one tree, one at a time over 2 or 3 hours. So there's lots of opportunities to enjoy these birds. It doesn't just have to be while they're in flight. So that's it. That's my spiel. I hope you enjoyed it. I would love some critical feedback if you're keen on morning flight and you think, oh, you're wrong, or oh, have you ever thought about it this way? I'm super keen on that. I'm also keen to try to help answer questions. You can leave a comment if you're seeing this on YouTube and I'll try to answer it. And I hope that you get the chance to get out there on a big day and really appreciate the spectacle that is morning flight. Standard social plugs if you're interested. I don't do it a lot, but I'll sometimes post anything interesting about weather or whatever on Blue Sky, upload videos like this on this YouTube handle. I'm slowly building a reference website that will take me the rest of my life to even get half completed. But it covers a lot of morning flight ideas, including most of this stuff in text form and different ways of presenting the ideas. As well as a lot more of the sort of like justification or examples of the flight, whether it's eBird checklists or videos where I've been out watching morning flight multiple days in a row at the same spot and documented how the composition of species or the directions that they're flying have changed. So if you're keen, if I've got you hooked, there's more to be found via the website link. Yeah, I hope you have some amazing birding out there. I am officially done.